Welcome to the Republic of Consciousness podcast for small presses. This is the Goldsmiths Prize for the novel at its most novel 2018 special. The Republic of Consciousness podcast for small presses is brought to you from the Contemporary Small Press Project at the University of Westminster. This year's shortlist for the Goldsmiths Prize for the novel at its most novel is this: Kudos, Rachel Cusk, Faber and Faber; Murmur, Will Eves, CB Editions; In Our Mad and Furious City, Guy Gunnaratney, Headline; The Cemetery in Barnes, Gabriel Josipovici, Carcanet; Crudo, Olivia Lange, Picador; The Long Take, Robin Robertson, Picador, Poetry. Around the table to discuss the shortlist is Catherine Taylor. Catherine is a freelance critic and writer. She was the Deputy Director of English Pen from 2014 to 2016. She has judged the Jewish Quarterly Wingate Prize, the European Union Prize for Literature, the Guardian First Book Award, the Harville Secker Young Translators Prize, and twice been a judge on the British Book Awards. She is a contributor to The Guardian Review, the FT Life and Arts, New Statesman, The Economist, Irish Times, and the TLS. At present, she is working on a cultural memoir of Sheffield in the 1970s and 80s, and she is a founder and a member of Rathbones Folio Prize Academy. Jonathan Mcaloon is a freelance journalist and critic whose writing about books, visual art and music has appeared in the Financial Times, The Guardian, The Telegraph, The Irish Times, the TLS and Time Out, amongst others. He has hosted talks at literary festivals and galleries and has appeared as a talking head on podcasts like this and BBC radio shows. Marcus Wright is a civil servant on principle with a predilection for Mandarin prose, free jazz and unexpected TV shows. He was the jazz critic for the now-defunct website The 44. He has been one of my most cherished cultural guides over the last 30 years. And finally, there is someone resembling me, Neil Griffiths, but not quite me in a modernist sort of way, so me really. I, Neil Griffiths, and not Cathy Acker, am a novelist and founder of the Republic of Consciousness Prize for small presses. My latest novel, As a God Might Be, is published by Dodo Inc. His previous novels, that's where the modernism comes in. My two previous novels both won prizes. So here we go. Why don't we start with Olivia Lange's Crudo? Catherine and Jonathan have both read it, and there seems to be a difference in point of view.
So, Catherine, like because you reviewed it for.
No, I didn't review it. I just read it.
Okay.
Pleasurably.
I thought so. The concept of Crudo is it's kind of, I think, a snippet of Olivia Lange's life in 2017, merged with Cathy Acker's whole life.
So I think I understand that Olivia Lange got the idea from reading Chris
Krause's biography and reviewing it for The Guardian, wasn't she?
Yeah.
And so she was, I think, on holiday, reading it by the pool and thought, oh, this would work. First of all, I think that it's quite ingenious because there's ready-made material already, probably more so than the kind of professional writer. You've already got this like really rich life experience involving kind of Times Square peep shows and all that kind of stuff, rather than kind of grants and university stints and sitting at home writing. So you've got this ready-made kind of life which you can draw on and add to your own new experience.
That's right.
And the what's happening in the moment in Twitter and things. And so that's all built in. I think the idea of it's very good, but of course kind of relaying things in the moment, especially with Trump, there's a lot of, God, how do we let this happen? Which is, it's the worst of Twitter. It's like the things where people feel things, so they say them. They don't have to justify them, but it reads white in a certain way. It's not...
Does that mean you think that is quite interesting, isn't it? Because you're sort of talking about reportage, if you like, which is kind of mixed in with fiction. But it sounds like you think that this kind of writing will become dated quite quickly. If that's how you're reading it.
The danger of this is obviously it can't, a book can't be brought out in a week. It can't be finished and
I think
then.
it was 7 weeks actually. To be fair.
Was it? So was it written in 7 weeks?
I think that's.
But then it was brought out months later, so it couldn't, it couldn't have been brought out straight away afterwards, like a week later.
No, that's not how.
So yeah, exactly. So it's not how
works.
publishing works. So you can never be completely on time and current. So that's not really an issue. It's not. I'm not really objecting to this as out of date now. It's a year. We know what happens. We know that this guy gets fired. We know that the mooch goes. Those things. Those aren't what I'm objecting about. I think it's more the kind of Trump has this effect where he makes people's responses to him facile because he's so ridiculous. So our response is, oh my God, this is dreadful. But you don't want to read in a book just someone goes,
I'm completely lost because I'm just in terms of
the book is very reactive, but it's also interweaving elements of Kathy, but by me. But she starts by saying I mean Kathy was getting married.
Yeah.
So she's putting the sort of persona of Kathy Acker onto certain events in Olivia
in her
own life
and the outside world.
And the outside world. But I think it's written in this kind of very, very clever. There's many apophthegms, aphoristic, kind of breathless kind of rush. But actually, in a way, I think it perfectly expresses how we receive information and news and how we kind
it does that well,
and how we actually sort of spew it up out again. And I'm not saying that Olivia's prose is in any way that kind of that she writes that, because I think she writes beautifully, but I think it really does encapsulate. I mean, my only objection was because you're thinking, oh, it's the worst summer, it's the hottest summer. It's actually this next year has perhaps been even more challenging, let's put it that way, to be a citizen in the world.
Did you not think with the by Kathy, I mean that stuff, did you not think the conceit wasn't completely synthesized? So, there'll be bits where it's kind of, Kathy was born 40 years ago, but Kathy also was in Kathy Acker's life, on the outsider art scene in the 80s, at the height of the HIV crisis, making outsider art. And so, for some reason, you the modernist part of your brain says, well, I get this. This person doesn't have to be a 10-year-old Brit on the art scene in New York in the 80s.
I'm glad that you've got a modernist part of your brain, because I'm just reaching for mine right now.
No,
I can't find it.
Well, exactly. So it's that thing where you think, okay, you make allowances for the fact that this world doesn't have to completely coalesce.
But of course, because it's fiction, remember, it's a novel.
No, of course. But I thought maybe that could have been managed in a slightly more silky way, especially considering a lot of the other stuff is kind of seamlessly, the reportage, the life, the inside information. What did Mark Namus call it? The sense press of information. That's done well.
Can I ask Marcus quickly? Does this make you want to read the book?
No.
Oh, we're terrible, aren't we?
My job here is
I already kind of. It's one of those books I kind of don't want to read, but I'll probably end up reading. Because there are so few books that you can kind of guarantee 2 or 3 other people will have read, so you tend to gravitate towards those, not always very profitably. But
you know what I found really interesting about it is it's a best-selling title, but actually the subject matter, like when I was a teenager, Kathy Acker's Blood and Guts in high school was hidden under my bed so my mum wouldn't see it. And she has had this sort of, she was a cult figure and she remains a cult figure. So it's really interesting that a novel that's really sort of based on her, if you like, to some extent, is actually a, Sunday Times bestseller.
Well, I remember trying to grapple with Kathy Acker.
Well, she's a very bad writer.
Back in an abysmal writer.
Terrible writer.
A charlatan, basically. But she was,
But I just bought Blood and Guts in high school for my 15-year-old daughter.
Good luck, Neil.
After asking...
after you see Heathers, the musical.
It was after... musical. I read the first couple of pages to decide, should I... I can remember reading bits of it... I think there was a South Bank show on Kathy Acker almost like the day after she published the book.
She was a celebrity,
Yeah.
I take your point. She was an outsider artist in a way. in the way she created.
Well, of course, and Lange is very interested. I actually wonder whether Olivia Lange would have liked to have written that Chris Kraus.
That's what I thought when I was.
I don't think.
Because often if I'm reviewing something, you get this cool non-fiction book. It's like that would be such a good idea, but it's just been done. Yeah. So it is a good idea, and I enjoyed it.
I kind of get the feeling that Kathy Acker is now more or less detached from the actual writing. She's gone on to that sort of higher stage of celebrity.
Yeah, yeah.
Like Wittgenstein or Glenn
just
Gould.
Figured them.
She seems to somehow encompass something that people respond to.
Yes, you don't really need to read any of her work.
But I have to say, the opening dialogue between the father and the daughter in those first 2 pages, having a 15-year-old daughter now, I suddenly thought, no, it's perfect. It's brilliantly written. I think it really is. The idea that she puts in brackets of the 12-year-old daughter. I think she's 12 when she starts. The fact that this young girl can talk to her father and can process her own moods at the same time is really well done. It's really well done.
But there's a strong chance it's just taken from somebody else's book.
Really?
I mean, that was
well, that's another interesting, isn't it? There's a kind of autofiction upon autofiction, if you like.
Right.
Moving on.
Okay, well, we'll go to.
So maybe Johnny, you'd like to talk about Our Mad and Furious City since you've read it.
Yeah, sure. So it's set on a North London estate, and it's one of those kind of polyvocal novels where there's lots of first-person narrators. 2 generations of them who live in this estate, and I'm actually surprised because I do think in previous years that would have been a Booker short. That's kind of the moment of. It's towards the more experimental end of a Booker Prize book, in the sense that it's very voice-led. So it's it's definitely got this Belovian quality where kind of a colloquial dialogue of these kids is lifted to the level of a literary plane without it having to involve these thoughts which maybe wouldn't occur to a young person.
Like Milton, actually.
So right, okay, yeah. And it's that it's like kind of Junot Diaz did this in his in all of his books. Yeah. So, but it's the similar. It's just on prose wise, it is the similar.
Yeah, he's not way or not.
Yeah, it's Junot Diaz.
For people not watching this on television, Catherine is having a sort of slightly ambiguous scowl.
No, so basically, regardless, moving away from, he's quite a controversial figure at the moment for many reasons. Yeah. But prose-wise, there's that kind of colloquial, dialectal language.
Yeah.
Filtered into this kind of stream of consciousness that really works, and I think he does that very well. And I just thought it was very well managed for what it was. In that kind of, there wasn't much in the way of plot. It was just about these people's lives, on the day to day. Because their lives don't really have a plot, perhaps. Because lives just don't have a plot, Catherine. No, they just don't. Lives don't have a plot.
We don't know what we're going to do after this podcast.
Do lives have a story though?
Oh yeah, lives have a story.
Well, you sold it to me. How about you, Marcus?
It's a good read. And it has a lot of flair, and I want to see what the writer does next. I reckon.
Is it a first novel?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one for Tinder Press.
He's a filmmaker,
actually.
I think.
Yeah,
I think previously made short films.
Tinder Press, the Birmingham outfit.
No, that's Tyndall Street Books, which don't think exists any longer. No. Please phone in and tell us if it does. Tinder Press is part of Headline, which is part of Hachette.
Okay.
So comes from a big publishing house. Yeah.
Okay, Rachel Cusk's Kudos.
Kudos, surely. There's no E.
The Americans say kudos, don't they?
But we're not American,
are
we? Are you Australian?
No.
Where did that come from?
Great segue.
A little bit.
Americans think I sound Australian.
What do you think, guys?
Well, I've known Marcus 35 years. He's not.
You might have always thought I sounded Australian.
Anyway, I was like, no, you were Australian.
Johnny's saying, I'm definitely keeping this in. This is podcast gold.
What
it could be the strain of the occasion.
Kudos.
Kudos.
Yeah.
kudos.
I would have said kudos, but
kudos.
Well, kudos. Well, you're from Newcastle and I'm from Sheffield, so.
yeah.
Did
What's
you say
that got?
kudos in Newcastle?
I don't think we say that. I think we say like
What do we?
some other word. Yeah.
Bit of a write-off.
What I mean, but what?
Great.
What do we understand by the what do we understand by the title then? Because
Well, it's Greek, isn't it?
no, I know, but people, you know, 10, 15
Being
10,
impressed by
10,
by
15
something is that? But
yeah,
that's wrong.
10, 15 years ago, people would say
Kudos for that.
kudos for that.
Yeah.
In fact,
Props to that.
I still say that.
Kudos.
Sorry, smart.
Um,
Actually, there is a section in the book where a young, dare I say it, millennial figure
A young hip character.
yeah. Well, Jonathan
explains at length
Trendy person.
the meaning of kudos, and sort of breaks it down in that way that Rachel Cusk does tend to kind of asseverate, to use a Rachel Cusk type word, in her fiction. So it is actually it's kind of very central. But I think Neil, you particularly love the last image in the novel.
Right. I mean, I my view of Rachel Cusk is I did a YouTube video where I said actually I feel as though I've maxed out on writing, not reading novels, and I need to just kind of go backwards and start again, because actually I thought I was nothing could surprise me, and then I picked up Outline and I was hugely surprised by it, but because she's I mean it's an interesting and wonderful and inventive literary voice, but there is a level of writerly intelligence about her that I just think very few people have.
That's
these
right, and I think
days.
it's very interesting to look at her evolution, since that's the word I'm going to use this evening, because when I was a young woman, it's unbelievable that I'm not anymore. When I first moved to London, Rachel Cusk's Saving Agnes was it won the Whitbread First Novel Award, and it was really a story of a early 20s young woman in London, which particularly fitted into, if you like, the early 90s, and just from there it was really, really well written. But from there to see how she's evolved into this kind of, as you say, this huge intelligence on the page, which I think a lot of people resent, because I think, it's not just about the persona of the author, but which obviously she sort of embeds. And there's a couple of caricatures. There's definitely a Knausgaard figure in there, and she is kind of sending up the literary scene, but actually she sort of folds it into the narrative so that it becomes completely natural, seamless, long paragraphs, dialogue embedded in those paragraphs, and but it's a short book, it leaves you feeling really despairing at the kind of nihilism. Yeah. But she's an existential writer in that respect, I think.
No, I think they are works of.
Well, I described it as a triptych, the trilogy, and I think that artistic endeavour is very much.
But it's her, I mean, her project, from what I understand, is that she wanted to find a way of making writing characters somehow more honest and real.
Well, they're all thoroughly unpleasant, if that's what.
No. I think it's something else than that. I think what she's doing is she's saying, what we could do is we could just say, I met this person on a plane, and now I'm going to recount what they say, and that is a kind of a version of reality.
Well, she's using
but she doesn't do that, does she? What she does is she's it's a kind of double bluff. She's saying, I'm actually going to. I'm not even going to ventriloquize these voices. I'm actually going to play back how I filtered them.
Yes,
into my mind.
And you have her own protagonist, Faye, but you know very little about Faye. She doesn't offer that information. Other people offer it to her. And I'm not going to give away what new stage she's moved on in this book.
But the honesty is if she gets off the plane and bumps into someone and recounts the passenger's story, she's recounting it through all of the filters and vectors of her own sensibilities and intelligence, and but that's actually what people do anyway in their writing.
Well, that's
they
goes back to that sort of polyvocal notion that you were talking about,
Yeah.
with, isn't it? But it's more internalised, perhaps.
She's not pretending anyone speaks like this. But
Maybe she does.
But she does. But she's saying, as a writer, actually that's what we do.
Yeah, we do,
Yeah.
and observe all the time.
Yeah,
Right.
but we transform what we're saying. We present it as true, and she's saying, I'm not presenting it as true because I'm taking away the speech marks, it's not even reported speech. It's something else. There's another degree of separation, but somehow it is finally getting to a place where it's honest, because that is how I filter this stuff. Does that make sense? You know, Marcus clearly is not.
No, I agree. I mean, I haven't read this one. I read the previous two, and they're very funny. And what you're saying is true. But I mean, the kind of the surface pleasure of it is this, particularly the first one, this series of grotesques cavorting with an utter lack of self-consciousness, and being brutally reported on. And as you point out, it is all through the subjectivity of the author, and there is something cruel about that, because these are fictional characters, and treating a fictional character who you can grant with as much interiority or complexity as you want in that way it's an entertaining choice, but perhaps a slightly strange one.
Yeah, I wondered whether these people were realer for her, for the second or third loop of transformation that she went through from, you know. But anyway, let's move on to
Another book.
Yeah. So I think we've caught Murmur, but should we just do? I'm just aware we have to be out of here at certain
I was just
points.
sort of saying that Murmur had its, well, obviously probably most novels have many genesises, origins. I don't know whether the recording caught this, was basically that Will Eaves was shortlisted for the BBC Short Story Prize 2017 for a fragment of Murmur, because obviously it's a book of fragments anyway. So it's interesting about how that's an interesting sort of take on the writing process, and how a short story can be melded, if you like, into a novel.
And well, often, I mean, the example I have, which for me really failed, was Ian McEwan's Enduring Love, because the
great opening para.
Yeah, it's the opening story, isn't it? It's of whatever, and then he thought, I've got something here.
And then I thought, I really always want to talk about this aspect of science.
Yeah.
And I'm really going to bore everybody for the next, you know. Yeah.
And in order to make my point really, really clear, I'm going to have a wife who's writing, who's a professor of romance, literature, and I'm going to be anyway. That's Ian McEwan, but that's Ian McEwan in every book, isn't it? The thing about Murmur, which I if it hasn't been caught, is the thing I'm grappling with, is the decision he took to not make it about, or not, or what did he do? He took essentially the core of
Alan Turing.
The core of Alan Turing's life, and say, I'm going to turn this into essentially what feels like a prose poem, and it not call the character Alan Turing. Yeah. And I don't know why that decision was. I can't tell why that decision was taken.
You're going to have to ask the author.
Yeah, but that seems to, and I think I did, but he didn't tell me because he was interrupted.
Oh.
Or didn't want to. But it's interesting for the reading experience. You're sitting there thinking, I thought, why has that decision been taken? And I couldn't understand why that decision had been taken. And do you think you should have? That is, you should be able to decode that at some point.
I don't know. I mean, I just think that's sort of delving perhaps too far into the intricacies of the whys and the wherefores of writing a novel or the novel. What do you think, Johnny?
Yeah.
Johnny's on WhatsApp.
No.
Have you read? You've only read bits of Murmur.
I've only read bits of Murmur, yeah. So I don't feel like I can.
Yeah, but I think what Neil's point is that decoding can stand for any novel that you're reading as to what you want to know, the reason why. And I wonder, because if you're a practitioner yourself, that you always want to know how somebody got from A to B.
I suppose you read, when you read about it, people say, it's doing something, it's trying to say something about the life of Alan Turing, and most of the detail in it has been drawn out from Alan Turing's life, but the character isn't Alan Turing; he's someone else.
Well, then it's making it a little bit more universal, perhaps.
It's just more, I haven't read it, but it's just more honest, isn't it?
Is it?
Well, he's not writing a biography, is he? He's writing.
Yeah.
I think we've gone back.
There's-
Interesting
there's
again.
that
We've
kind
got
of
this whole thing with the Crudo and the
non-fictional
Caviaca.
conceit of
Yeah.
not feeling
And
like you have
what's
the right to
interesting is that
impose fictional events on this
We're looking
person's
at
life.
a lot of books with kind of, they don't seem to be, and with the Rachel Cusk on this list, that actually have quite similar themes, but they're not very obviously similar.
No, and that might be true.
Which probably brings us to, have we missed one before?
There's the book.
Robin Robertson's
Robert
book.
Robertson.
Yeah, which there was a lot of contention, wasn't there? Because
It shouldn't have been eligible for the Booker.
allegedly.
Ooh,
Are you saying you're saying that? Okay, great.
Well, it's if it was, no, I mean, it's pointless me going into it again, but it was published as a
Picador.
poem,
Yeah.
Picador poetry.
God, does everyone remember Vikram Seth's Golden Gate?
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, because that's a long time ago.
Yeah.
I remember really liking that.
Really,
Oh, I love The Suitable Boy. But anyway,
I know. Didn't he?
remember Elizabeth Browning's Aurora Lee. Sorry, moving on.
Did he-
I loved that.
Did he not?
See, that's the perfect example, Neil. So we were talking before with Jacques about, Neil was like, but surely before the novel, everything had always been written in poetry. There's nothing kind of innovative about, or there was, there's
No,
epic
I was
poems
thinking
and
that
then
the novel.
it was
The novel was a
separate.
kind of antidote.
Yeah.
To poetry.
in the sense it was prose.
There was novel. There was narrative poems. There was epic poems.
But also,
there was-
so there's also Eugene Onegin, which is
Absolutely.
a
So I
novel
would say,
in verse.
and also I'd say Aurora Lee.
And Aurora
which
Lee,
I
she
do
built that,
think
didn't she, as a
of.
novel in verse? Yeah.
Absolutely. But because she's female, nobody really pays much attention to it.
But I'm actually talking about a kind of practical thing. If they'd called it a novel in verse, then that would have made it eligible for the Booker Prize. But they didn't. They published it as poetry.
Well, if you like, then the graphic novel that was on the shortlist that actually contains more pictures than words. To be very basic.
That was just.
Point,
But the thing is, I started.
Don't get him started on the graphic novel. He's just like, comic
dear.
books
No.
and that.
No, it's not even. It's not that they're comic books. Is that the novel, the literary project, is one of words mainly. So
I think it's
people
interesting
say
because
everyone says what about Zabel? They were out of focus pictures once every 20 pages.
Yeah.
That is slightly different to someone than a graphic novel.
It's good now because he's had time to refine his argument. It's much, it's much.
we're moving on back onto the long take, which is a beautiful production. I have a copy of it, and it. Yeah, I mean.
This is the Robertson poem.
Yeah, it's a prose poem.
Okay, that's fine.
And I think in the way that the brain adjusts to reading, I started it and I'm not reading it as a poem.
I mean,
Actually.
how
That's not just because I was told it.
There's lots of things now. There's Max Porter's Grief is a Thing with Feathers. There's Megan Hunter's The End We Start From.
Yeah, tiny paragraph.
Which are essentially it's verse, but because it's fragmentary and it's essentially prose poetry or bits of prose, bits of poems, it feels more novelistic than an unbroken verse. But there shouldn't have to be.
I think
that
what's
shouldn't have
interesting
to
is
be
that
the
the way
distinction.
it's also talking about prizes and relevancies and relevancies. The Man Booker a few years ago was very up in arms about, was it Damon Galgot's In a Strange Room, because that was deemed to be short stories, as was David Chalet mispronouncing everybody.
Yeah.
I can't pronounce it.
If This Is a Man, which is essentially
it was,
a series of short stories.
And not very good
so
ones. But
remember, it comes back to the whole way about, just in terms of criteria, about how prizes are constantly reinventing themselves, and they're also listening to what other prizes are doing.
but the problem is, for me, is that the book rejects certain books because they are marketed. So in its terms and conditions, it says if the book is marketed as a novella or it is marketed as a short story, it is not eligible. And so it says you can't. So it has its constraints, and
we don't know that this book was submitted for the prize. It could have been called in.
Yes, that is.
So
true.
I think there you get to whatever reasoning behind it. I suspect it wasn't submitted for the prize by Picador. I suspect it was called in. So.
Which would be the case with Sabrina and the genre novel.
Let's not talk about that one.
Why? I mean, no, it's a travesty. And actually, one thing I want to do is quickly just say.
Why shouldn't we talk about it? Because it's a travesty.
No,
travesty when the feeling's gone.
The one book that I think should have been on the Booker long list and should have been on the book on the Goldsmiths shortlist.
Sight by Jesse Greengrass
is Alex Phoebe's Lucia. Now it's not on the shortlist of the Goldsmiths because he went to Goldsmiths and therefore he's So as far as I'm concerned, anyone who wins the Goldsmiths Prize is simply going to win it because Roger Federer didn't turn up to play. I mean, I think it's if you're going to have a rule where possibly that one of the strongest novels of the year is ineligible because the guy went there 10 years ago. Well,
there are lots of bizarre rules surrounding prizes that kind of make great books ineligible, unfortunately. But I think we've talked about everything but...
So it's your moment.
It's your moment in the spotlight, Marcus.
The Cemetery in Barnes by Gabriel Josipovici. Yeah,
we were going to discuss the pronunciation of his name because I was always Josipovici.
Yes, I think it is.
You think it is?
I think you might actually be right for a change.
Yeah, no, because downstairs
Neil,
I was pretty
kudos Griffiths here.
Should we all agree on one then? So Josipovici.
Yeah.
Is that what we're saying?
I don't know. Have
you
you
met?
met?
Forever hold
it's
our
not going
peace.
to come easily to me.
Well, somebody pronounced it correctly at me today, and
Okay,
now I've forgotten.
Okay.
No.
The author.
The author, yes. Gabriel J.
So both. So Marcus has read it because Marcus just to give background. So we were talking about Josipovic's book on modernism, and this had just arrived as a submission to the Republic Consciousness Prize for Small Presses. So I suggested that Marcus read it, and you've read it.
And I haven't read it, alas.
Alas.
Even though I've got it at home.
Or not, you don't know, because I have no idea what either of these people think about it.
Well, I wouldn't be able to comment on it anyway, because I'm a judge on this prize this year.
Right. Oh, that's true, isn't it? Of course, yeah. I will add that into your biography.
Had either of you read any of his fiction before?
I have no read.
No, the RofC.
Yeah.
Had you read any of his other fiction?
I haven't, no.
No. The only book I read was the one on modernism, which I suppose probably slightly coloured the way I came to it. But I seem to be in a slightly odd position of being sort of well respected, but I suspect not very well read. Anyway, I mean, thanks for putting this in my direction. Terrific book. I've got 2 or 3 minutes to summarise it,
however you want.
Well, it's kind of a book that defies pricey, but on I suppose the most basic level, it's an unidentified narrator recounting a man's account of 3 passages of his life. His married life in Putney, then after the death of that wife, apparently a period in Paris where he kind of recuperates through. He's a translator, I should add. He kind of recuperates through a very strictly compartmentalised routine life, immerses himself in rather rarefied art, the poetry of a French Renaissance poet called de Bellay, who's a new name to me, and Monteverdi, specifically Orphée, and the Orpheus myth is kind of running through this in various ways. And then the third stage, oh sorry, am I too far away? Yeah. The third stage, he's living with his second wife, or I should probably call her his wife, that is his second wife, in Wales. And I think I guess if you've only read the first 10 or 20 pages, it might look as if it's going to be a rather conventional, perhaps slightly pedestrian account of
one guy's life.
One guy's journey to healing through early music.
This sounds like a great strapline, I have to say.
And then quite quickly, things start going wrong and stories stop adding up. And a darker side to this character emerges, and you start thinking it's going to be a different kind of book, which is perhaps a kind of highbrow thriller. There are 2 reviews on Amazon, and one of them is one of those sort of 5-star, it arrived on time and it was well packaged reviews. And the other one is basically, this is a really highbrow thriller. It's going to keep you guessing right till the end. So it's shaping up to be one of those books where the
You'll be turning all
it sounds
90
a bit like
pages.
Images Amsterdam should have been.
Well, it does have that slight feeling of
It was
one of
written
those
by
sort of
Thomas
bookerish
Bernhard.
jeu d'esprit, where like Amsterdam or The Sense of an Ending or something like that, where there's going to be some sort of unmasking and some sort of twist. And people on Amazon again say I had to go right back to the beginning to look for all the clues I'd missed. And then you realise it isn't going to be that kind of book at all.
Thrilling. That's really.
It's kind of a metafiction to you. I don't know. Do people still talk about metafiction?
Yes, all the time, particularly in any review I write. I use
Right.
that word.
Right.
Striking
Same.
it off now, I have to say.
And it's written in very lucid, sort of slightly formal, slightly sort of Sibaldian prose. It's very easy to read. It's just beautifully done. It's beautifully structured. The repetitions, the clues, the modulations are all superbly done. It's a terrific piece of work, I think.
It was the modulations which got me. So, the way he switches between all 3 periods of his life, from the beginning will be done, paragraph to paragraph, and the time will be marked by who he's talking to, who this guy is, And he would often say to his wife, his first wife, in Putney. So it's like, in Thomas Bernhard, it'd be kind of what's in The Loser, where it's like, as I thought, as I walked to the inn, another thought, blah, 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 I was still walking to the inn, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So there's that, but between paragraphs, it will just constantly route it back 20 years before, then go forward, and it will all be quite seamless, and then there'll be bits completely verbatim repeated, and which will then slightly alternate towards the end. And certain things where you think, he talks a lot about the alternate lives we all could have leaded and we do in our heads, especially when we're alone, sitting translating in our Paris attic, listening to Monteverdi's L'Orfeo, those things. And you realise that if you read it one way, which is him trying to cover up certain things that he's done or prevaricating to the reader, then he could have been a murderer. Or that's an alternative life for him in which he could have done this, or he could have never met his first wife, or this could have happened. Like, all the outcomes sort of go a bit choose your own ending,
but I mean,
which is quite satisfying in such a short book.
I mean, the only thing I came up with is it's an example of the unreliable everything.
Oh, Neil, I feel your distress.
The last Roddy Doyle book was a bit like that, where in the end it was like, oh yeah, and it's all since he went to school, it's all been.
And then he woke up.
Exactly.
No, but
And Bobby Ewing came out of the shower.
But it's a beautiful example of him just
Dallas, you're too young.
of each story. There is just a moment where it shifts, and you go, I'm not entirely sure what happened then. I'm not entirely sure what he's committing to inside the narrative.
Yeah.
And there is, towards the end, there is these extraordinary passages in the house in Wales with my wife, my second wife, where every perception is shifted, isn't it?
Yeah.
From how wonderful their home life is and how wonderful their guests are and how much wonderful conversation their guests have. All of that just begins to get peeled away to the point where no
one had good conversation. No. It was always people would corner me and I wouldn't want to talk to them.
And so I ended up, and I think this is beautifully ambiguous. So the idea that anyone is going to find clues, the idea that it's going to think it's going to be a thriller, none of that is true.
There's no clue. Yeah,
it's a thriller, but it has got lots of what can only be described as clues. They're just not clues to anything, if you like. They can't
so they don't lead anywhere necessarily.
Yeah, the clues like there's a piece of string which just goes off and it's there and that's it.
But is it? I mean,
it's all dead ends.
It's very playful then.
Yeah, it's cool.
You could say,
but it seems really serious as you read it. It's that thing where it's only afterwards do you realize, God, that was really playful.
Do you think he wrote it in 7 weeks on a Tuscan holiday?
I reckon he's gifted enough to have written it quite quickly. But probably not
any day over this 7 weeks of Tuscan holiday, to be honest.
But I don't even know whether there was a first wife. I don't know whether because first you think it's very concrete. He says
he could have easily followed his ex-wife to the end of the street and then she looked and saw him, so he never spoke to her again, and so he never married her.
Sounds very, if you don't mind me saying so, Modiano-esque. So Patrick Modiano essentially writes the same novel over and over again, and since he won the Nobel, they've been republished and lots of different books. But
it must have been arduous to read them all for a long article.
There's a wonderful book called Missing Person, and it seems quite similar about that. There is a missing person, but of course you actually realise when you come to the end of the book that the missing person is the narrator. And it seems like to me that those kind of sort of holes in the narrative and the sort of clues leading nowhere, but they're just kind of put there almost as, if you like, little teasers and puzzlers and little objets d'art.
I mean, a French film has done this, I think, in the night. And who is it? It's an extraordinary film. I can't remember what it is.
Not Cécile. It's not Cécile. Céline et Julie en bateau.
No, is it The Obscure Objects of Desire? Is that Buñuel?
That's Buñuel.
Buñuel film. Where
almost any French film actually could pick up these.
He was Spanish,
wasn't
he?
Spanish.
But he would essentially change the lead actress from scene to scene. I mean, there was at least 2 actresses. Yeah. And essentially, that's what's unsettling. Is that the wife is different each time. And in this, he's very concrete. He says, sometimes I would listen to my wife, rehearsals, whatever. I could go and listen to her quartet, but he may never have married her.
Well, it's an odd mixture.
The time he stood her up on a date.
Or he just
sliding doors, really. If you don't mind me being a bit
with following the person you're married to everywhere in a really creepy way.
But it does
and potentially killing them.
It does remind me of a couple of Modiano novels. Right. I'd be interested to know if he had read much Modiano. Obviously, I've read too much. Yeah. But I can't now, you see, I can't wait to read it for the prize.
It's quite fun to give us a sort of reading group grappling with this.
Yes.
And, what do you think the motivations of the central character are? And,
but there isn't even a cemetery.
What do you think motivations are?
No, but it doesn't have to be.
I think there is.
Is it not called A Cemetery in Julian Barnes? Is that not really the term?
But it's actually very specific.
Because it's set in Putney.
Yeah, Barnes isn't very far from Putney.
It's not.
It's far enough.
But does there have to be a cemetery in Barnes, considering what you were
And then I followed
about,
Julian Barnes down the street from a distance when he went to his quartets, and then I threw him into the river. Thank God for that.
Thank you to my guests, Catherine, Jonathan and Marcus. I hope it was entertaining, elevating, enlightening and enriching. Our house composer is Doofus. This week's track is School Play. In a few days we'll be uploading the Republic of Consciousness podcast's Extra Extra, read all about it, Catherine Taylor on the Brixton Review of Books. 3rd edition out very shortly. If you like this and want to support us, you can go to Patreon and search for Republic of Consciousness. The lowest tier of support is $2. So that's it. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to you joining us next time.
Once a victim fell, till she